Welcome everyone to another OZeWAI Ask the Professionals. Very excited for this one. We have got a lot of interest in accessibility testing. So I'm Bree Norton. I'm co-chair with Amanda of OZeWAI. We're a not-for-profit organisation for digital accessibility professionals. We used to run an annual conference. We now are a professionalisation, membership professionalisation. So you can actually join and learn more from us and from each other. We see it as a great networking opportunity. And these events are growing so well. OZeWAI also does a lot of advocacy work. We've just recently done some strategy planning for the next year. So if you are interested in joining OZeWAI, please do. We have a variety of membership options, with the cheapest one being $50 for annual membership. And that helps us support for these events, especially if we do start doing some more with Auslan interpreters and things like that we'd like to bring in. So to get us started, I'm just going to do an acknowledgement of country as well. So I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting today here in Canberra, and pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and all Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. And feel free to put who you are, your role, and who you pay your respects to around Australia or even around the world in the chat. So I'm just trying to mute some people there. There we go. So we have a wonderful panel with us today to talk about accessibility testing. It's something that we all have to do at some stage, sometimes maybe a bit late than we do. But I'm actually going to hand over to our moderator today, to Gian Wild from AccessibilityOz, and let her do the first introduction, and then she'll introduce the three panelists. And if you need to, please put, again, put your name and your role and where you pay your respects to in the chat. And also, please put any questions you have, and we'll make sure that they go through to Gian to be moderated and ask the panel. I'm sure you have lots of questions, so please send them through. Over to you, Gian.
Thanks, Bree. Thank you everyone for coming today, and I'd like to introduce our three excellent presenters. Amanda Mace, who I have known for many, many years over in Perth, Hans Hillen, and Karl McCabe. I myself have been running AccessibilityOz for 14 years, but you're not here to talk about me. But please, as Bree said, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we'll make sure that they get answered. So Amanda, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Gian. So Amanda Mace. I am vice president of a accessibility company called GrackleDocs. I take care of the Australasia region, which basically puts me in charge of sort of Australia, New Zealand, and Asia, growing GrackleDocs, what we do, and how we do it, and spreading the word. So a lot of really evangelist work around digital accessibility is basically my role. I also head up our audit team. So I'm in charge of a team of testers, both usability testers and technical WCAG auditors.
Excellent, thank you. Next, Hans Hillen, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Hans Hillen. I work for a company called TGPI. It's an accessibility firm from the United States. I've been there for quite a while as a tester originally, starting in the mid-2000s. But more recently, the last few years, I've been active as in a role as a content team, content provider. So basically content engineering, and I'm now the director of Knowledge Center at TPGI. And I work there with Ricky, who you've had on before.
Excellent. Thank you. And Karl McCabe?
Thanks, Gian. Yeah, I'm Karl. I'm digital accessibility lead at BankWest here in Perth. So yeah, in charge of setting up our accessibility program here, I suppose. So previously I've worked at Telstra with Sean Murphy, who I think you've had on here before as well. And before that, we started off working with Amanda doing accessibility auditing. So yeah, I've been doing this for about 5 years, background in design. So yeah, that was a kind of a logical leap for me. That's kind of my story.
Excellent. I might get started again with you, Amanda. So you told us a bit about your role, but can you tell us why accessibility is important to you and what kind of brought you to accessibility?
Yeah, so my story into accessibility is a bit of an interesting one. It kind of, well, no, it did. It started with me with a glass of wine in my hand, as all good things do. Um, and I was at my best friend's house. My son had just been born, my middle child. And I was really just complaining about how I really wanted to go back to work, but I wanted to be at home with the kids. And I was really struggling to kind of do everything. And my best friend said, my mom started this company and you could work from home. And I was like, cool, what does she do? And she said, digital accessibility. I'm like, cool, what's that? And that's really my introduction. So I was incredibly lucky. I was my best friend, Rebecca. Her mom is Dr. Vivian Conway, who has a very good name and reputation throughout. She's since retired. But she was at the time still doing her PhD in the National Transition Strategy and what that meant here for Australia and accessibility in the digital space, particularly with government and big corporate. And so my introduction to accessibility was sitting around Beck's a dining room table the following day and Vivian literally saying to me, have you ever thought about how someone with a disability would use Facebook or check their emails and she just went on and I was like, no, I hadn't. And that just sparked something in me. And as most people who have fallen into this industry will find is the passion just grew from there. The people that I've met, the things that I've learned, like once you know it, you can't unlearn it. So once you know that keyboard access is essential, you can't stop. It has probably ruined every website ever for me since that moment. And that moment was, well, 12 years ago. So Lev's 12 now. So 12 years ago is when I started. And I was just incredibly lucky to have Vivian really take me under her wing. And she brought me to everything. She brought me to OZeWAI. She had me, once I was sort of trained up, she really held my hand through the training, gave me opportunities to learn, brought me to different places in the world. I've co-authored book chapters and textbooks on accessibility. Academic papers, just things I would have never imagined 12 years ago that I would be doing. And I've been, yeah, really grateful to have that experience and find myself here.
Excellent. Yeah, Vivian's just an amazing person, a force of nature. So Hans, so how is accessibility important to you and what brought you to accessibility?
For me, it goes back to my university days when I was still in the Netherlands, which is where I'm from originally. I was doing a research project about website navigation for blind internet users. So I came at it from a very academic point of view. I was reading lots of papers and lots of theory and, a research study about whether a homepage reader or JAWS are more effective. And I thought I knew it all. And then I got invited by the Mozilla Foundation to come to the CSUM conference, which is a very popular accessibility conference in the United States. And that's where I really found out that, the real world of day-to-day accessibility, where all the people that are involved with it on a daily basis and who it really affects. And I had to kind of relearn a lot of things and have get that practical experience. And I saw the impact that it had on people. And I now have people in my own family that have disabilities. And I can just see how things like that affect them every day. So for me, it's just a much cooler version of, getting into IT or tech or development. It's like a specialized area that affects people directly. And I think it's a great field of work. And I'm still here today.
Excellent. Thank you. And Karl, what about you? How is accessibility important to you and what brought you to accessibility?
Yeah, well, I'll answer the important question first. Why is it important? Like, I think when it comes down to it, obviously it's just right. Like it's critical that people have equal access to the digital world. Everything's becoming increasingly digital. So like, it's just critical for that everyone is able to access things. So I think that's it in short. How did I get into it? Well, my first introduction to WCAG was like a little terrifying, as it probably is for a lot of people, but I did a design degree at uni, and I did some web development units, and one of my lecturers introduced the concept of accessibility to us. And so I searched up WCAG and opened it up and was just like, okay, like pretty quickly closed it back down because I had no idea like what any of it meant. And then from there, like I finished uni, and by that point I just really had a desire to, put to work in something like echoing what Hans said, that can really have a direct impact on people. I was really interested in UX, but also really interested in development. I love doing accessibility, that we get to sort of work in both those spaces, work with closely with designers, with developers. Those are two pretty key groups of people when it comes to accessibility. But yeah, really just comes down to wanting to do work that I could see was having a direct and real impact positively on people.
Excellent. And so, Amanda, how do you think you get started in understanding accessibility testing? Like, as Karl said, he opened up WCAG 2 and was like, oh, no, let's not look at that. It can be incredibly overwhelming. And it's really funny because WCAG 1 was seen as too complex. And when you look at it now, it's like 64 checkpoints and it was like really, really simple. And then WCAG 2 took it to a whole nother level. So, how do you get started in kind of understanding this when, the WCAG 2 documents are just so complex?
Well, you don't start with the WCAG 2 documents. The first report. So I tell people that if they are having trouble sleeping at night, open up the standard and read through it. That's not the place to start. The place to start is, in fact, there's so many places to start. It's almost overwhelming. So if you Google WCAG, you will get a million hits back, and everyone has a different starting point, what their top checks are. For me, it's always about finding find 5 things. Just find your low-hanging fruit. So there are things that are going to block access for a large number of people. Check your keyboard access. Make sure alt text is correct. Like the real simple low-hanging fruit. And so most people, if you look at most accessibility firms have like a top 5 checks. They're pretty on par. Like if you look across, I reckon it's Hans, Karl, and I had a conversation about what our top 5 checks are. We'd probably come up with the same 5. Start there. Start with the low-hanging fruit. If nothing else, because you need to give yourself pat on the back on the way through, or else it does become almost depressing. Like, oh God, how big is this? Because accessibility, when people go, oh, well, how long will this take? Or how big do you think this is? I'm like, how long is a piece of string? This is a journey. So I kind of say, bring it down to sort of those top 5, start with things like alt text and keyboard access and captioning for videos. Like just get the small things right first and then open up WCAG.
Yeah, I find that it's a great reference material when you're not sure and the answer is in WCAG somewhere. You just have to go looking for it. But one of the things that Bree has just mentioned in the chat is the OZeWAI resources getting started with accessibility. For those that don't have access to the chat, that's ozewai.org/resources/getting-started-with-accessibility. And there's also the TPGI top 5 tests web accessibility. So that's www.tpgi.com/top-5 tests-web-accessibility. So what about you, Hans? You run the knowledge base. So does that mean that you don't necessarily, look to WCAG 2 all the time? It's a knowledge base that your testers reference, or is it something else?
So we have our own test procedures to cover all the success criteria. I definitely agree that if you're just getting started, that's ticking off the list of all the success criteria isn't probably a good place, for you mentally to do that. But, start with the low-hanging fruit. And I would also say, obviously, there's lots of articles written and videos out there already. But I think to get started as a teaching tool, AI these days can be really helpful, where you can ask a AI chatbot to simplify it to a level that is good for you and explain like, look, I'm just starting out, I'm interested in accessibility, and can you just tell me what are some really basic things that I can focus on to start with? And you'll get into your headings and your landmarks, your alt text, your form labels, basic things like that. Because if you start getting into the way more complicated stuff, like the dynamic web components and complex widgets and composite widgets and stuff like that, and focus management issues, you need experience to be able to grasp those in a meaningful way. And just reading WCAG is not going to help you if you don't have the practical experience. So yeah, if you're just starting out and you don't want to invest in like a full training or stuff like that, you just want to see what it's all about. Read articles like the ones you've mentioned. Get an AI to kind of help you. AIs can also help you create a test plan, for example, which gives you the basic checkpoints of what you should check for, and you can ask follow-up questions, which is something that you can do with an article. You can't easily ask a follow-up question. I mean, you can in the comments sometime, but by the time you get an answer, it's a different story. And with an AI bot, you can just ask a question and nobody else has to know what you asked or what you needed to have explained. And I'm finding it extremely useful, not so much for accessibility, but for other things that I'm trying to learn. It's a great teaching tool.
Excellent, thank you. And Karl, what about yourself? How would you get started in understanding accessibility testing?
Yeah, good. Echo everything that Hans and Amanda had to say. I think probably avoid looking at anything to do with WCAG. Like, absolutely agree with that point. Even the understanding documents, I think you need, just to interpret them correctly, you need a level of experience. So like, it's no use misinterpreting those things. I think it can be difficult to find like good information though, but obviously like looking on websites like OZeWAI, going to TPGI, GrackleDocs, Vision Australia, Entopia, like these places that like have experience and have information is a good place to look. But I think in terms of just getting started and doing something like, when people first hear about the concept of accessibility, there's often like a big excitement and a desire to like, let's fix everything right now, like let's do this. This is right. And like, that's a pretty good way to burn yourself out like immediately. We need to acknowledge that like you can't fix everything right now. Like there's lots of different barriers and things you need to navigate depending on what you're working on and who you're working with, and particularly if you're working in a large organization, there's a lot to navigate there. Even simple things like getting a screen reader installed on your work machine might be something that takes a very long time in a large organization. So like look at what tools you have right now that you can test on. Like the keyboard, obviously. I don't know of any IT department that blocks the use of a keyboard. So that's a good place to start. Keyboard testing, color, alt text, and definitely like always look left first, I would say. So like before you even start testing in what your developers are doing, like look at what your designers are doing, because that's always going to inform what comes next, like when you're looking at that product life cycle. So I would always say start there. And when you're just looking at the designs, there's a lot less to consider because you don't, well, I mean, yeah, ideally you're going to consider what's going to happen when we try and build this thing. But when you're just starting out, you can look at things like color, things that you can control. Yeah, that's what I would do. That'd be my advice.
Excellent. Thank you. Hans, talking about AI, Do you have any opinion on AI for alt text, especially the accuracy, the utility, wisdom, and perhaps how the different AIs differ, Chat GPT versus Perplexity, etc. I myself note, as we all do, that you can't really, rely on the word generate a description for me. But do you think there's, what are the other AIs like? Have you had much experience with that?
Yeah. So about 8 months ago, Jacob Nielsen had an article that caused a lot of stir, where he basically said that accessibility was obsolete. I don't know if you remember that, but I thought about that because, first of all, my initial reaction was, well, of course it isn't. But I thought about things like, alt text. And I remember to the very beginning of my accessibility career, our first client, we had alt text. We had stock photography images, smiling people, shaking hands in a business environment. And my training, and again, I came from kind of this very rule-based academic kind of mindset. I had learned that, those images are decorative, so they need to get a null alt, it's an empty string as alt text. And then the client came back with a bug report saying, "Hey, you forgot alternative text for these images. Don't you know that that's important?" And she started explaining to me why I had to add alt text to images, and she was like, "Well, I kind of thought you guys knew that already." And I had to explain to her, "No, that's actually, you're not supposed to do that for those images." And it turned out that neither of us was right or wrong about that. And the answer is, if the question is, what is the perfect alt text? The answer is, there is no such thing, because it all depends on what the user at that point is interested in. So she wanted to convey kind of the emotion and the vibe of those images of, we're friendly here, we're corporate. I thought it was decorative. But then there's, probably thousands of visitors to that website that all have their own opinion. And we can't settle on a single alt text that is going to please anybody, because somebody might be interested in, a basic description of the purpose, as we usually in accessibility think about it. What is the purpose of this image? What function does it have? And describe that in a short, concise way. Somebody might be interested in the colors being used, or what clothes people are wearing in the image. Somebody visiting might be working together with a sighted person over the phone, and that person says, "Oh yeah, there's an image of a woman in a red dress. You have to click on that." And okay, well, that's not in my alt text. And what I agree with Jacob Nielsen is that, why are we deciding for everybody who encounters that image what the perfect alt text is, or why are we even pretending that that is possible? So my feeling is, we need to come up with a default text, but I would really like it to become kind of a standard way of working, is that you use something like Be My Eyes or other AI tools. Like, for example, the JAWS screen reader has a built-in image reader now that will query ChatGPT for you and give you a description, and you can ask follow-up questions. And that is kind of where I would like to get to, is that we provide the basic kind of stub of an alt text, not too long, but informative about the purpose, but give the user the opportunity to follow up and get as detailed as a description as they need. Some people like verbosity, some people don't. Some people have follow-up questions about other things they want to know, some people don't. So I don't agree with letting AI generate all your alt text from the start, because a lot of people will agree that you get a very overly verbose, flowery descriptions of things that you're not necessarily interested in. But I am a proponent of letting users follow up on these images themselves, and kind of letting us as accessibility people and developer off the hook of not describing every single detail in an image, and just focusing on the purpose, and then make it clear to people like, hey, you have a tool here that you can use to ask about this image and get more information about it. I think if you think about that kind of interaction, we're not outsourcing it to AI to come up with alt text so that we don't have to anymore, but we can provide a basic alt text and rely on the AI to help the user out to get their personalized descriptions for that image from the interest of that person.
That's fantastic. I never thought of it that way, and I've always had that concern, as I'm sure every accessibility specialist has, that everyone is different in terms of what kind of alt attribute they want. So that sounds like a really good use of AI as opposed to just generating descriptions. Amanda, do you have any comments on using AI for alt text other than Hans' excellent answer? I don't know how you're going to follow that.
Yeah, I don't know how to follow that either. The only thing I would say is that the challenge with AI is that every time you ask it a question, you can ask it the same question 5 times, you'll get 5 different answers.
Yeah.
So the challenge always with AI is that it's continuously grabbing different information. So I think that and Hans, you've brought up an excellent point, that opportunity for users to have control over what more information they want and really paring it down from a content accessibility point of view. We always, when we talk to clients, it's, look, this is purely decorative. We're not going to fail it if you give it alt text that doesn't really need it. Like, giving the user the opportunity to get more information via their assistive technology, I think, is a great approach. I think the challenge with AI is that AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. So it'll give you 100 different answers if you ask it 100 different times. That's probably my only addition to that. I think that AI will continue to play a role going forward in accessibility. I don't think we should be scared of it. It's not going to replace humans. Skynet is not going online anytime soon, but I do think that it is something that can help enhance us as testers. I think it will help enhance accessibility as a whole, as long as we sort of harness that power for good.
Especially, I completely agree with the whole AI different answers. And I actually came across this last night. I even took a screenshot, and I asked the average price of a pack of cigarettes in Australia. And initially, so there's 5 different answers in the same section, which says, the first section says it's between $25 and $50. The second section says it's $22, which is the equivalent of US $17. And then it says, the next one says it's $40, and the next one says it's $45. So even in the same answer, you can get different answers. And obviously, and I know that cigarettes cost about $50 in Australia. So, it's something that you really can't necessarily always trust. So it's not something that you can just, let loose. And
definitely don't use it for life-threatening situations, to like, which medicine should I be taking in this case, or what's the limit I can take, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it can be dangerous. Karl, what about yourself? Any comments on, AI and its utility in accessibility testing?
Yeah, well, not too much to add to that. I mean, I think Hans covered it all, but I would just say, like, the problem, at least at the moment, with AI, like, what it can't do is understand what the human intent behind placing that image in that place was, or take in the context of, like, the surrounding page. So, like, usually a designer's put an image there for a reason, and like, they will know what that is, but like, only them and only their team will know. AI doesn't really have a way of knowing that. And I think, like Hans mentioned, like, trying to chase this idea of a perfect alt text, like, it doesn't really exist. But I think the important thing from what Hans said was that the idea of putting that control into the user's hands, like, that's really, like, I think that's the ultimate, really. People can customize things to their own needs.
Excellent, thank you. Amanda, do you have any ideas on what type of testing is, good to consider for accessibility? I mean, a couple of my testers have a history, a background in, just unit testing and things like that, and then they moved into accessibility testing. Whereas I've got other staff who, started in accessibility and, kind of learnt the concept of testing on the way. Do you sort of see, what would be good specifically for accessibility and how accessibility testing differs from the other types of testing that's around?
Yeah, well, I think I've seen all sorts. So, you know, Karl came to me when I first met Karl straight out of uni with a design background. The same time we hired Karl, we hired a couple of other people. One of them had an editing background, another one had a development background. What I really love about accessibility when it comes to testing is that you latch on to there are certain criteria, and I suspect Karl, we work together now as contractor and client, but you had certain things that you always, as an auditor on my team, you always you went for it. You knew that that was like the first thing that you would draw to. And I think that most testers probably have a first thing or a first couple of things they're always drawn to. And it probably depends very much on your background about what it is that hooks you in. So I've kind of said, so I've now 12 years. Of those 12 years, I've probably been the last 9 leading an audit team. And with those 9 years, I've had quite a few people. And I think it's always about the attitude. You can come to me with no skill set in development or design. I can teach you how to test for accessibility if you've got the right attitude. If you're doing it for the right reasons, I feel really confident that I can teach you how to do it. The technical is really about attitude. So I don't think there is a perfect, where to start from. I came with no technical background whatsoever, no design background. And without patting myself on the back, I turned out okay. So I think it's really about the attitude. It's about your approach. If you have the right attitude, then you can learn. And that was sort of, I guess, imparted on me from Vivian, and I hope I do that for the teams that I've led.
And Karl, you said you came from a design background. Did you have any, knowledge of regular testing? And, what kind of testing do you think is really specific to accessibility?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one of the things that you see, I mean, it touches on a point that I think is really important as when working as an accessibility specialist, you are working with these different teams, the way you communicate with a designer needs to be different to the way you communicate with a developer. If you're going to get stuff done and reduce that friction that can often be there. So yeah. Sorry, what actually was the question?
Did you have any knowledge of regular testing prior to accessibility testing, and what types of testing do you think you should cover when it comes to accessibility?
Oh yeah, not so much, definitely not from a dev point of view. But what types of testing? I mean, yeah, you kind of combine all the things, I suppose. Obviously it's important to use automated tools where we can to speed up the process and interpret what their output is. Testing on different types of devices, different platforms, different different screen reader and browser combinations in terms of you got Mac, you got Windows, and then the two big mobile platforms. Ideally you're doing all 4 of those, but I think just doing something is important, getting started and doing something, not trying to do it all at once.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Hans, you came from an academic perspective. So did you have any knowledge of any other testing, and what kind of accessibility testing do you feel that is the best to use?
Yeah, I came mostly at it from a human-computer interaction point of view. So we spent a lot of time back then at uni doing waterfall models and stuff like that, testing phases and I think for accessibility, especially if you're just starting out and you don't have all these rules in your head already, using a kind of a semi-automated tool is always good. So, for example, WebAIM has tools that you can use. TGPI has their own color contrast analyzer, and Arc Toolkit, for example, there's things like Axe. They can help you to kind of run. They're kind of automated tests, but it's not just a push of a button. Like you get results, you get to see the interpretation of those results, and you still have to decide like what to do with those results. And that's kind of how you learn. Like these are the things I need to check for, and these are the results that I need to manually kind of verify whether they're real issues or not. And you can kind of see what kind of issues are involved, and that will help you kind of get into the rhythm of performing these tests. I think in general, getting to know your way around a screen reader is definitely useful, because if you can get through a site with a screen reader, you've already covered quite a few issues to test for, and then there's always the popular saying that your keyboard is your best testing tool, where just put away your mouse or your trackpads and go to a web page with just a keyboard, and if you can get through it that way, then that's great. If you can't, then you'll find out very quickly where the accessibility issues are.
Yeah, Gian, if I can just add, the one thing that we haven't mentioned, because of course we've been talking more about from an WCAG auditing point of view, is user testing. So using people with lived experience is really important to validate those findings. You can have something that passes WCAG and fails usability. So it's really important that we marry both of those things together where we can. I know that's not the priority in lots of organizations. It's kind of a bare minimum. Let's just try and meet WCAG, but validating what WCAG is telling us is super important as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
My colleague David Sloan has this analogy of you have a library, and people can go in through the front where there's steps. It's not wheelchair accessible, but in the back there's a wheelchair accessible ramp that you can get into the library, but that ramp is completely covered with litter and rubbish, and it's not well maintained, no good lighting, and it's just very unpleasant and not easy to get in that way. So while it's technically accessible, it's not usable necessarily. And that is, I completely agree with Amanda that you'll find those usability issues by getting actual people who live with this stuff on a day-to-day basis. You'll find those kind of issues as well.
Yeah, it's important to remember, like some of the tools that we use, like a screen reader, for example, I'm not going to use it the same way Andrew will use it. And it's important to remember that as testers, we're using these tools, particularly when we're using assistive technology, we're using them in a different way. We're using them for testing versus using them as someone with a lived experience who's relying on it every day. So it's incredibly important that we keep that in the back of our minds. Whenever I teach people to use a screen reader, I always remind them, if you want, you can turn this off and see what you're doing. So remember that you're using it with the context of testing, and that a lived experience is going to be a little bit different.
Yeah,
I actually have a counter to that as well. And I guess I'm going to quote Nielsen again, but some of his usability principles are, first of all, the user is always right. And second, the user is not always right. So while it's definitely good to test with actual people and get their actual experiences, sometimes what I see is that a company will have their residents, user testing person, like they have a person who is blind or a person who can't use a mouse or something, and then they tend to rearrange their whole strategy based on whatever that person says. And a lot of what that person says is personal preference. Like they want the navigation menus to come after the main content in the reading order. Okay, well, that's fine that person likes that better, but we can now rearrange everything just for that, because the next person is going to say, hey, why is the navigation menu after the main content? That is very inconsistent with how websites usually work, and I didn't expect it that way. And why don't you just use a skip link? So with the user testing, you have to keep in mind you get personal experiences, and that's exactly what you're going to get. And if you get 20 people to do user testing for you, you can easily get 20 different results. Now, some of them, things that are real solid issues, they'll all report, but some of them are just going to be like, well, I don't like it when list items say bullet at the start, or I don't like that it keeps saying tabs. Like, why is it saying tabs? And then they'll say like, well, it's a tab list. That's what this widget is called. Well, I don't understand what that means. So, and then is the result that you have to get rid of your tab list? Maybe, but not necessarily. So you have to take it, put it all in perspective and combine the accessibility testing, where even though you're not a daily user, although daily users could do that too, you combine that testing where you have a lot of rules and heuristics that you're sticking to, with those personal experiences from people.
I think therefore, like it's important that if you are going to do user testing, that you actually get someone who's very skilled as an assistive technology user. And we as an accessibility company, and most of the other accessibility companies, often have people on staff that have a significant disability and reliant on that assistive technology to access their content. And I think, Hans, you're absolutely right. You can't just sort of have someone down in the admin side or whatever just testing your site. It is important that that person has some knowledge of accessibility testing if you're going to rely on them solely. If you're going to do user testing, you're going to get 20 people with a screen reader, then you can kind of like average it out, but you can't really rely on that one person. And it is also something that I've seen as people start with accessibility, they kind of focus on screen reader accessibility to the exception of absolutely everything else, and it's like it's so much bigger than that. So yes, thank you, Karl. Did you have anything that you wanted to talk about in that terms of that?
The only
User
thing
testing.
I'd add to that is, like just the importance of having people with experience to interpret the results of user testing. Like that's like an important piece of the puzzle there. Like on what Hans was saying, and as well, like it highlights the importance of not getting too hung up on WCAG. Like it's really easy, especially you're working in a large organization, there's timelines. You're going to run into people who have that checkbox mentality, and they're like, what do I have to do to meet WCAG? Or like, is this good enough? Can we make this meet WCAG? Like, I think if you're asking those kind of questions, then there's probably a deeper issue with like that component of that thing you're working on. So like, I always try and avoid where possible, like making it about WCAG necessarily, and bring it back to talking about the user. And I think especially when you're dealing with UXs, you'll find that they will understand that really easily because that's their job all the time. And obviously we need WCAG there. Like it's a baseline, like, and we need to use it, and we need to make sure like we're meeting it. But I think when you're talking to people who aren't accessibility specialists, like it's not always helpful to lead with WCAG.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the what you just said, the requirements of having experienced user testers, unfortunately, means that you're missing a very large group of inexperienced AT testers. And I've seen, for example, for banks, who did user testing, they set up this whole new app, mobile app for their banking software, and they thought about all the possible scenarios and all the different things, but it was always under the assumption that whoever's using it actually knew how to use voiceover, or had experience with using talkback and knew kind of the gestures and the tricks that you have to know to be able to use that. And people just got stuck and said, well, I have no idea what to do. Like, I don't know how this works. And at some point you just don't know if you're testing their proficiency with the software or the quality of your product. And unfortunately, when you have certain apps like banking software or government websites that need to be available to everybody, especially since, as we said before, physical locations are disappearing, like places where you can go to deal with the government or with your bank. It's all becoming digital now. It's extremely important that you still find a way to make it as simple and easy to use as possible, and basically as usable as possible, even for people who are less experienced.
Excellent. Well, I think
like, that just springs to mind, like there's functionalities like that, what do you on iOS that VoiceOver can do, like, one that I didn't even know about until recently was like when you increase with the increasing text size, and you can like hold down on the thing and it'll bring up the bigger version of it on the screen. And I was talking to like one of my colleagues about this, and she said that when they did user test this, and no one knew that it even existed. So it's like it almost may as well not exist, right? Like you can't rely on that functionality to be like, that's like heading back towards that like box checking kind of mentality. Like I think like any user experience, the simpler it is to interact with, the better usually, right? And like at the core, like accessibility is user experience. And like I think that same approach, not trying to look for tricky ways and cool ways to make stuff happen. Your developer comes to you with a cool new thing that they've learned. The simplest approach is usually the best in my experience.
Yeah,
that's kind of the worrying news, that the best accessible website is probably something that looks like it's from the late 90s. Extremely
but
simple.
Not for people with cognitive disabilities. And I certainly, I try to explain to developers that if there's something that's in HTML, use it. Don't create a new feature and add ARIA, because HTML already has all those accessibility features. Well, thank you very much. Let's take a 5-minute break, just to, stand up, grab a coffee, use the restrooms, and we'll come back at 10:02 with a couple more of your questions. Thank you very much.
See you soon.
Sorry, just Gianna, I'll just press the button already. We actually can continue because it's been recording anyway, but everyone else on the call could take a break. That's fine. So I think you can continue with the questions.
The questions. Yep. Okay, excellent.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So just on that, the whole user testing with people with disabilities, we have a question from the chat, which is, a common question I get is, have you tested with people with disabilities? This has two big challenges. One, finding people who rely on accessible website assistive tech. And two, there is no archetype. Everyone has different needs. What are some practical approaches to these challenges? So I'll start with you, Amanda, because you talked about, user testing as well. The whole testing with people with disabilities. Now, I'm kind of a bit of a WCAG purist, so I don't believe you have to test with people with disabilities if you properly follow WCAG, but I think it's also a very, very good idea that you do. What about yourself?
Yeah, so I think it kind of depends on the context. So we get two different types of people or organizations coming to us asking for user testing. The first is, we know it's crap. We need evidence. We need you to give us the ammunition. So we're very happy to do that and tell them that it's absolute rubbish. The other type is, hey, we put in all this work. We've been, you've been holding us hand through this process, and we want to validate. Those are the two reasons really for bringing in a group of testers who have lived experience. There are two really easy ways to do it. One is put your money where your mouth is and get an accessibility firm that has a user testing group that includes people with lived experience, like a GrackleDocs or an AccessibilityOz. I don't know actually if TGPI does, but a lot of the accessibility firms do. The second is to reach out to your own user base and see if there are people within that. The only thing I don't like about that is oftentimes that becomes either something that they've done for free, giving you free feedback. That's not okay. Pay them. Or you give them a gift card. And again, that's not okay. Pay people. Yep. Include this as part of your general user research. And it depends on the organization, how much an organization's investing in sort of that type of user research, right? So usability testing like that in big corporations happens, but if you're in a small not-for-profit, the likelihood of you really doing, sort of user testing, especially including people with lived experience, is going to be much less likely. But reach out to your user base is probably the easiest. And then the second is there are organizations that literally do this and can hold your hand through that process and make sure it's done well. So those are probably the two easiest ways to do it.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, you absolutely have to pay these people. It's an expert, expert task that you're asking them to do, and they deserve to be paid for their time. Hans, what about yourself? How do you find people who can test your site with lived experience, and what do you do, because everyone has different needs?
Yeah, so I mean, we find that, as you said, those people need to be paid, and it's generally expensive, to do proper user testing, especially if you have like a proper, usability lab or something, or an AT lab where you want to do these things. And we find that, people just don't often want to pay extra for this stuff. Occasionally we have a client that is really interested in it, and that's great. If you're just starting out and you're kind of on a smaller scale, then looking in your own community for people who might be interested in earning some money that way, I think could be a great way to set up contacts. Like if you have certain people that you can reach whenever you get a request like that and people are willing to actually pay for it, that you can call them and say, hey, we have, a testing session going on. We have a location. We have some AT set up, or you can come with your own product, and here's what you'll get as a payment for that. There's lots of local like message boards and things like that for people with certain needs that come together, and you can build up kind of your own portfolio of knowing a person to kind of cover most of the profiles. I mean, everybody's needs is different, that's true, but it usually you have a few testing profiles that you're kind of can identify. If you can find a way to get to know people who are interested in making some cash that way, and who are good at providing feedback, obviously they need to provide useful feedback to the client. Then you have a really valuable product, because then you can say, look, we do accessibility testing. We also do user testing. And because it's very small scale, it actually is not that expensive. And you can get really useful feedback from that. And I have seen a lot of companies where the owner or a team leader says, I didn't get it until I saw somebody struggle through my product that we're all proud of making, but now I saw that it completely fell apart, and somebody actually couldn't make the transaction on our site or on our app, and I just felt really bad about it, and now I get it. So if you can get actual testers to show a client what their product is like, then that is a great selling tool, basically, or a convincing tool, a evangelizing tool.
Excellent. And Karl, what about yourself? How do you do any user testing with people with disabilities at BankWest?
Yeah, it's definitely like something that like you always want to do. Like getting it to happen in practice is often more difficult, for a number of reasons. And I think it varies, like depending on, like Amanda said, if you're a large corporation with a lot of money, or you're a small not-for-profit or something local community thing, like it's going to be more difficult. Or the challenges are different, I suppose. Definitely, like when you're in these large organizations, they tend to be risk averse. Obviously, they want to, like, you can't be like handing out gift cards for a bit of user testing to people with disabilities. Like it's extra sensitive, because we know that it's an underemployed, underpaid like group of people in society. Like we know this for a fact. So like I think when you're doing it at a corporate scale, like it's really important to, it's going to be important to the business to ensure that people are being paid properly and it's done in the right way and all that sort of thing. But the other thing you can do is like look, like if you're a big company, you've probably got a lot of staff. You can look internally, like obviously, like you're not supposed to do that from a pure user testing point of view, but you can get useful insights, and hopefully you've got some people with disabilities on your staff.
Excellent. So OZeWAI has just put out a link to the 5 principles for inclusive research that that covers that kind of stuff. So my next question, I'll start with you, Amanda, is how did you get buy-in with senior stakeholders that accessibility needs to be incorporated throughout the delivery journey, particularly when resource costs are a factor? And so how much additional time, effort did you factor into the delivery time? This is the one thing I always have with clients is it's great that you include us and, the design stage and template stage to do some testing, but you also have to include time fixes and then a time for retest and then maybe fixes again. And, that doesn't help if you tested the template and by the time you've got the audit done, they're releasing the final site. Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so it depends who you're talking to. So the more upper the management, the more you actually point to their own ethics frameworks, values, mission, vision, because those statements all include things around treating people with respect and dignity and inclusion. It's almost the easiest to get buy-in at the very top. It's the people who are doing the work that it's harder. Not because they don't want to do it. Oftentimes they're the first ones who want to do it. It's a matter of, they've got time constraints and KPIs to meet and functionality bugs that get, pushed up the priority list. So for me, it's about sitting down with that team, with that person and going, okay, well, let's look at this in a practical way. We have to stop looking at accessibility as we can fix it all tomorrow. We can't. This is a journey, and that means we're going to have to prioritize. And there's some, everyone has their own way of prioritizing. The most obvious being WCAG gives us literally level A, double A, triple A. And so that's probably the first level of prioritization. And then after that, it's about you sitting down with those stakeholders. So for me, it's all about relationships. Get to know that person. The thing that will get that light bulb going is going to be different depending on the person. For some people, it's going to be sitting with someone who is struggling with barriers to use that application or to use that website. For other people, it's going to be, there's a risk here. And you have to kind of know who you're talking to have that. So I think so much of our role, it's really interesting because we think of our role as like a technical role. As an auditor, I'm a technical person. I do technical audits. But the truth is, I'm a relationship person. I'm a people person. It's about getting people on board. And that's probably the skill set. When we talk about skill sets of what testers need, that's a skill set that they need. If they're going to sit down with a client, is to be able to build that relationship and really understand what it is that's going to make them tick. And help prioritize. So there isn't a one answer to that, frankly. It really depends on who you're talking to. But I think always use what internally is already there. Because Karl's on the call, I know there are other BankWest people on the call. Like with BankWest, one of the things that we talk about is like the ABA is mandating this. The Australian Banking Association mandates WCAG. So we have to have this conversation. We have to report back on what this is doing, what we're doing. As a bank to further our accessibility journey. And we're so lucky that in Australia, we're not as litigious as America. So we have this opportunity to really build in the journey of accessibility and show people that we're doing the right thing and we're living up to our own values as organizations.
Excellent. And so, Karl, what do you have problems with seeing, as much as you can tell us, getting senior stakeholders on board or even just the project managers, just sort of saying, hey, you can't turn this around in 3 weeks. You have to include, a couple of weeks of testing as well.
Geez, you're making the external comms people very nervous here, Gian. I think, yeah, I completely agree with the journey that Amanda talks about. Like we just need to acknowledge that we can't do everything right now, and that's okay. And we're starting somewhere and we're building. I think, like, particularly when you're working internally, like in a corporate setting, you need friends in a lot of places to get this stuff done. Like the product life cycle like moves from left to right, like as we all know. So like, you need to have your designers on side, your developers on side, some POs like or product managers, and generally senior leadership are like on board, like conceptually, most of the time. So like I think when it comes to working in a large organization, like I always say, like, make friends in low places. Like, to get stuff done in a corporate setting, avoid going up as much as possible. Like if you can sort something out between you and the designer working on this project, or you and the developers and the QA testers, and not involve the product manager, that's ideal, you know?
Excellent. And Hans, what about yourself? How do you find, I suppose it's a bit different, we're on the other side of the fence, but when you're
Right.
dealing with project managers and things, how do you convince them that there needs to be additional time for that testing effort and that, regression testing and fixes?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our clients are in the United States, and they are a litigious bunch, and in a way, yeah, I mean that's a bit of a cynical point of view, but it kind of works, because a lot of these clients that come to us, they are not facing litigation. They are just don't want to have to deal with that. So they are already kind of in the mindset when they come to us that this is necessary. And we've obviously had a few clients where, they thought it was just a one and done deal, and you spend a month working on something and you give them a report and then you never hear from them again. But we've also had quite a few other clients that actually came back and said, hey, we actually tried this, and this workaround for NVDA didn't work, or what now, or it's not announcing it properly. And then we actually, had to come up with better solutions, and those are the best clients. And I agree that, make friends in low places, like Karl said, because those are the people who will do the actual work. But in the end, those people need to have the cycles available to do that work, and that needs to come from higher up. And I remember, again, early in my career, I was being onboarded somewhere in the States in a developer team. And that manager there was just not impressed at all of why it was there or why it was necessary. And I was trying to explain to him why, it's important for people that this is for, that things are improved. And basically he said, well, why would a blind person use this product? Like, that never happens. And I said, no, exactly. It doesn't happen because your product is very inaccessible. And, we're talking about a group that may be relatively small compared to your entire user base, but for who it matters all the more that this is accessible, because they may not be able to leave their house, or they may not be able to see a screen. So, it's, I think, like Amanda said, you kind of need to know who you're talking to and see what their best approach is, whether it's the carrot or the stick, or the sense of morality, or, like we said before, showing them what their product is like for certain users. Because in the end, it does have to come from the top, where there's there's a system set in place where it's not just a single contract or a single test, but they actually set up training for themselves, for the sort of new people who come in can learn about, the way that company handles accessibility, that they have time available to fix regression issues, do retests, set up unit tests, integration tests, functional tests. It's a continuing thing. And I think maybe you can explain it as, just like the bug fixes are never done, the accessibility bug fixes are also never done. So you just need to understand that this is something that needs to happen on a continuous basis. And going back to the people in low places, I often see somebody who is the accessibility dude in their company, or dudette, and they are kind of an isolated island where they're trying to influence things within the whole company, and they can't because it's not getting the support from higher up. And it's usually those kind of evangelists that are struggling a lot and feeling like they're not getting where they need to be, or not getting their company where they need to be. So yeah, I probably would try talking more to the higher ups and show them, the benefits of that this can make, especially if you can then also show them how much worse it would be if they let it get out of hand and then have to fix it after the fact because somebody is suing them or is complaining about them or putting them on blast on the socials, and bad publicity like that can cause a lot of damage, especially if you then have to go ahead and fix things after the fact. So, yeah, I don't have a clear answer because everybody's dealing with this problem. And in the end, you just need to have a client who's motivated to actually make a change. And if you're dealing with a client who is from the start already not interested, or they have this bare minimum mentality that Karl was mentioning before, where the idea is, well, I don't care about any of this stuff. Just tell me what needs to change. So that, and then sometimes there's lawyers involved that say, like, nothing, we're not interested about the reasons behind it or who it affects. Like, what can we get away with to not be sued anymore, for example, and that's just, you're never going to get anywhere with a client like that because they are just not into it or not motivated to do it. And since accessibility is a continuous thing, whatever you do there will just get washed away afterwards. And sometimes you just need to realize that some clients are motivated and some clients are not, and the clients that are, those are the ones that you focus your energy on and your passion, and the ones that are not, you just give them what they ask for and then you move on.
It's a culture
Unfortunately, that's
thing,
just the
isn't
way it
it?
is.
Like it comes down to culture. And sometimes that culture can be built if you've got the right people in place. So one of the things that I talk about is like building champions in-house. Because if you're getting it from all angles, whether that be sort of the workers in content design and dev, and there's at least a couple of champions in each of those teams, and they're all talking the same language about accessibility, then that's always going to put some pressure on to get it done. But it's about culture ultimately. Accessibility requires cultural change within an organization. And sometimes
Yeah.
that can take a really long time. I've had clients where I've been putting out spot fires for a decade, and they're always going to be the client that I'll have to put out spot fires for the next another decade. But there are clients where I was putting out spot fires for the first 5 years, and then something clicked. The right person got on board, the right champion championed it internally, and that meant that we could push in a different way with more power, and we were able to see cultural change on the inside. I've got a number of people, and there's even some in this call where I've seen them go from one organization to another, and they've brought that passion with them, and they've created cultural change inside of that organization or that government department. And that's a really powerful thing. You want to make friends with those people because those are the people who will make change really happen. And the important change is a cultural one.
Yeah,
And I
Yeah, and I often find that
quickly, and that cultural, like those champion people, after, like, you pretty quickly realize who they are. They're passionate, they ask you questions, and like that cultural change, like going back to what Hans said about, the support of senior leadership, that's where it really starts. And you absolutely need the support of senior leadership. Like, if you don't have that, you're going to have a hell of a time. But like it's all levels. But I think that cultural change, like, it does start at the top. And when you come across those roadblock kind of people, like Hans was talking about before, like, you need to go up at that point. So you need that support there. And I think, yeah, like it's different at different organizations. Like we're really fortunate at BankWest. I haven't come across any of those people yet. But yeah, I have done in the past, and it's really challenging and can burn up a lot of time because you almost can't win when it's like they just don't care. They want to like tick this box that they're being forced to tick and get on with it. And like, you know, sometimes there's a reason behind that. Like, you know, when you're dealing with these different groups of people from different parts of the business, like we need to exercise compassion on them too, because like Hans was saying, like, you know, a product manager will be working, you know, that team might be working in sprints. You know, do they have the time available to, like you said, going back to where we started, like to do the retesting and probably some more retesting, especially if it's new, and get that all done and then get the release out. And then the next thing's already knocking on the door. So like those people are under a lot of pressures.
Mm.
Sorry, Hans.
Hans,
That's right.
did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Amanda that one thing that I guess I've noticed from being in this line of work for a while now is that you see kind of new generations of people coming in, and I have noticed a really big shift. So I started in 2005, right? And I've noticed a really big shift in, even though accessibility is not always necessarily a required curriculum at like colleges and universities and stuff like that. Developers are coming out, they're starting into this business with a mindset of, I want to be a responsible coder. I want to create something that is standards compliant and is lightweight and elegant. And accessibility is always a part of that. So if you look at, for example, a lot of blog posts out there about certain components that somebody's built, there's always an accessibility section. Now, it might be a limited understanding of accessibility. You know, they might have misinterpreted certain things or thought that, you know, adding certain attributes was useful or not. But it's definitely on people's minds, and it's definitely the attitude of this is the good thing to do, whereas it used to be, well, what's accessibility? Why would we do that? You know, never heard of it. And that is definitely a cultural shift that I've noticed. And for designers too, you know, if you look at like what people are doing in Figma, there's lots of accessibility plugins and just awareness of what color contrast is and stuff like that. One thing that I've also noticed is just the problem with high turnaround. Like I've spent time training people in organizations, and then like a month later, they had all been shuffled around or, you know, left the company and new people came in, and then you have to start all over again. And one thing that is important to focus on is that there is always a way to get the new people up and running with like a basic set of onboarding training to explain what the accessibility approach is in the company. And yeah, it's as hard that if you find those people that are like the champions, they tend, you know, they tend to be very popular, and they tend to just be snatched away somewhere else, and then you have to start all over again with somebody else and make them a champion. So it's a very fluid situation, but that's just the way it is.
And if you're interested in accessibility training, our last Ask Your Professionals was on that. So look that up and have a look. So talking more about the specific kind of accessibility testing that you do, I might start with you, Amanda. How do you manage the device operating system browser AT balance? You know, like if you tested all Android devices, would be here till, you know, well, you know, we just couldn't do it. I think the last count was 14,000 different operating system and browser combinations. So should testing cover everything? I think the answer to that is probably no. But, you know, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, so look, I suspect that different organizations will have different answers to this. For us, I think we have 4 standard iOS devices, 4 standard Android devices, and then our default browsers are Chrome and Firefox, Edge if we absolutely have to and it's requested, and Safari, well, only under torture. So frankly, we do the best we can in terms of combinations. We can't test everything. And it depends too. So we'll try and line up with whatever the QA team is doing. So depending on the organization, so some organizations come to us, they don't have a QA testing team. They're just coming to us going, hey, do the accessibility testing. And we kind of have our defaults for that. But oftentimes we'll go, so for example, with a BankWest, we'll be like, okay, well, what are the QA testers testing in? Here's what we're going to test in and make sure those line up at least a little bit. And those combinations are still popular combinations. So we'll use things like the WebAIM survey to be like, what are combinations for assistive technology like screen readers and Zoom text? Like what browsers are being used right now? We'll utilize that latest data as part of our testing stream so that we know we're capturing, at least a majority of users.
Excellent. And so we have a question. Why is Safari so bad? And I thought I'd give that to you, to Amanda.
Where to start? I don't know the answer. Ask Apple, but Safari is terrible. It's really terrible. It's always been terrible. I don't know that I've seen significant improvement. I suspect in a company like Apple, much like with Microsoft, there are things they do really well and other things that just continually get sort of, oh yeah, we'll deal with that. And unfortunately, Safari seems to be one of those.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have an answer. I don't know why it's so bad, but it is absolutely shocking.
Yeah. And I've just put a link to the WebAIM screen reader survey in the chat as well. So Hans, what about yourself? Where do you draw the line? How do you manage the device, operating system, browser, combination requirements?
Yeah, you definitely can't deal with all the permutations. So in a way, it's a positive thing that Chromium has gotten such a wide reach now, and that other browsers have started to switch to it so that you don't have to deal with all those different versions. And speaking of Safari, I remember when Safari for Windows was still a thing, to still make it even worse. If you want to see a bad Safari, then look at that one. And then I remember having to test with IE6. And
that was terrible.
Even on my first day, I was asking, do we test with Netscape 4 as well? Because I wasn't sure if that was still, if I should still be doing that or not. And, things have improved a lot. It used to be that a version number was a world of difference or took years to arrive. Now, who knows what version of Chrome you're on, or Firefox or Edge? It's just all in the double digits now, and everybody gets automatically updated. So things are a lot more standardized. It's less of a crucial difference to test in all the different browsers. So if you have a good standards compliant website that works well with some profiles that you test for, then I think that should be enough. So yeah, usually, we'll use a combination like Chrome and JAWS, or Firefox and NVDA, and then the mobile ones, one per mobile. But
huge
in the
kudos to
end,
the user agents for coming to the table, by the way, because that wasn't always the case. And Gian, you'll remember a time at W3C where the user agents, meaning the browsers, were not coming to the table at all. And they do come to the table now. There is much more consistency. Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah. And Karl, what about yourself? Is there a set standard at BankWest as to what you test against?
Yeah, like it's sort of, I guess it depends, like it changes from organization to organization, but like, yeah, you got to test in Chrome, right? Like it's so popular, that just makes sense. And like Hans said, it's kind of a good thing. But yeah, like Chrome and NVDA, Chrome and JAWS, like you throw Firefox in there as well if you can. You're like, you might be kind of restricted by what you have access to. So like, just test on what you have. Like, I think, like, well, if you're looking at mobile app, obviously, like you test on the platforms that your app releases to, like an Android and an iOS device, and you'll usually, that'll be dictated by like what you can get hold of at your company. That might mean that you've only got a brand new Android device to test on and not an older one, which isn't ideal, but like, it's often, you're often dictated to what your combinations of things that you can test on by what's available, like, and what your IT department can get on your machine, or and all those sorts of things. So I think, like Hans said, if your website is sort of like is meeting the standard, from a code point of view, hopefully it's mostly going to translate well everywhere.
Yeah. So
I have a follow-up question, actually. As you probably know, on iOS, all the browsers are basically running Safari in the under the hood. But earlier this year, there was a decision by the European Union that in the European Union, Apple had to allow other browser vendors to release their own apps on iOS because EU has this thing against monopolies and stuff like that. So we're now in a situation where in the European Union, at least, you can get an actual Chrome under the hood or Firefox under the hood. Does that mean that we're now adding these extra permutations to our testing profiles? Or do we just pretend that that is not a thing and stick to just the default Safari testing on iOS?
So I've been chair of the Mobile Accessibility Testing Committee for since 2017. And we've actually come up with some mobile accessibility testing guidelines. And what we say is that the latest version of iOS and Android, but and if you're using a Samsung phone, use Chrome, right? You don't ever use the internet browser that's, packaged with Samsung. But the biggest thing is to look at your statistics and see what your users are using. So with regards to if you do find a unique accessibility issues related to specific browsers or browser versions, where do you go? Is that something that you feel as testers you're responsible for, or is it just a case of saying to the developer, we've found this issue on this browser version or whatever, go fix it? Or do you go, investigate what the issue could be and, how do you do that? Like, where do you go to find specific browser problems? Amanda, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so because we always test on a minimum of 2 different browsers, regardless, if there's something that is happening in one browser, not the other, we'll point it out that it's a specific browser issue. We keep our browsers up to date. So that, like, from a standard point of view at GrackleDocs, our audit team always has the latest edition of the browser. So it really is, if we find a difference, we'll let them know this happened, say, in Firefox. It did not happen in Chrome. We leave that to them to decide how they address that. It may be that their user base is entirely, their statistics are showing them that they're entirely Google Chrome and they're not going to worry about a Firefox bug. But we let them know that we believe this to be a browser bug. The challenge always is it really a browser bug? Who knows? We don't always know the answer, but that's the way that we handle it.
And what about yourself, Karl? Do you, go and figure out what the actual issue is, or is that something you leave to the devs?
I'll tend to try and find out myself, like, because I want to know anyway. It's helpful to know for the future. And then, try and work with your devs to get it fixed. But like, it raises an interesting point around, like, when there is a browser bug, like the one that comes to mind is the multi-level headers and tables in Chrome bug, like, that just don't work. Like, so what do you do? Do you say that's not my responsibility? Or do you say, well, our users need to be able to use this, so we're going to work around this? Like, I tend to think the latter. But if it's a browser bug, like, obviously there's nothing you can do about it. Like, if you can work around it some way, then I think we should try and do.
And Hans, is there a specific place you go when you find a browser bug to figure out what the issue could be?
Yeah, I always want to figure out where the issue occurs, and it's extremely useful that these days the modern browsers all have an accessibility tab in their DevTools, so you can actually see what kind of semantics is the browser exposing to a screen reader, for example. Whereas if you use a screen reader to determine that, you never know, well, is this my screen reader acting up or the website or the browser. And now you can actually see, yeah, this is what Chrome is sending to the accessibility API of the operating system. Now, I would say it's an extremely slippery slope to start working around a browser bug. And I speak from experience because I've been down really deep rabbit holes to get around NVDA doing things in a certain way in a certain browser, or JAWS doing a certain thing in a certain browser, or VoiceOver in Safari. And it never ends. You always go down deeper and deeper. Now, with something like multi-level tables, yeah, you could say, we're just going to have a different design, different layout that doesn't do that. And that's fine because, that new design will work. It's a lot of work for a client to have to do, and you can definitely not back it up with WCAG or any kind of standard because they didn't do anything wrong. It really comes down to the motivation of the client to actually get it to work with their users. But they might also be motivated to actually start contributing to some of these browser bugs, and actually help those companies fix those bugs, which in the end is the best solution. But I find that if you start like adding hacks to things, like you figured out that, well, I can get the screen reader to read something the right way if I wrap it in another element with some weird role, and only then it will work. That is really a step in the wrong direction. One thing I remember in particular was the early days of ARIA, where for whatever reason, this ARIA spec said that a dialogue was supposed to be kind of a model element that only had some focusable elements in it, like an OK and a cancel button. So screen readers back then would turn off their virtual mode within those dialogues, which means that you can only tab around and you can't actually reach any elements that are not focusable. But of course, a lot of dialogues have entire end user license agreements in them, or forms, or sections of text, entire documents. And we had no way to actually make that accessible until we started wrapping the dialogue contents in a document role, and then NVDA started saying clickable on every element. And there was always something, and in the end, it just ended up getting worse and worse. And we've figured out we're spending so much time working around these shortcomings when it's really just the spec and the browsers that need to update it, and they have now. But what was the point of all of that? I was trying to do that.
We're running out of time, and I just want to give you all 10 seconds to tell me your favorite automated testing tools. Then I'm going to hand it over to Bree. So Amanda, you're first, 10 seconds. I'll tell it starting now. Favorite automated accessibility testing tools. Go.
Arc Toolkit for web and GrackleGo for documents.
Okay, that was easy. You got 4 seconds left. Not anymore. Hans, 10 seconds to tell me your favorite automated accessibility testing tools.
Oh, definitely also Arc Toolkit and Arc itself. It's a great testing suite. Yeah, that's all I can think of right now.
Excellent. And what about yourself, Karl?
I like Ali Quick Check, and also use Arc. And I still like the web dev toolbar thing for sometimes for showing certain things. It's just easier to get that to show.
Is that Chris Pederick's web developer toolbar?
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
The classic one.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, over to you, Bree. Sorry, we're running a couple of minutes late. Just
No,
great conversation.
It always does. It just seems to just fly past. And what a wonderful session! And thank you to our wonderful panelists and for moderating as well, Gian. It's just so nice to have our members really get involved in these, and we really, really appreciate all your time, all your knowledge that you've shared. It's been absolutely brilliant, and lots of questions being asked. Keep the discussions going. Join OZeWAI. We are looking at a members only area where we're going to keep these discussions going after Ask the Professionals. There's some upcoming events coming up in December on legislation and policy. We have 2 sessions. They went out in the newsletter yesterday. If you haven't subscribed to the newsletter yet, please do so. Please consider joining OZeWAI. Help support us. We're all volunteers, but we do have some costs that we need to cover, and we do want to partner with the right events. So that also helps us to provide the services and the details you need So yes, so thank you again, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at one of our legislation and policy sessions in December. Thank you all.
Thanks for having me.